The stars had always been there. Every night, they hung above the earth like a promise no one was allowed to keep. Children grew up pointing at them. Scientists spent lifetimes studying them. Poets wrote about them for thousands of years. The stars were humanity's oldest dream. But dreams, it turned out, could be blocked. Commander Yara Ose stood at the observation window of the UN platform Meridian and stared out into the dark. She had stood at this window 100 times before. She knew every patrol line the Concorde ships flew. She knew the exact moment their signal repeaters cycled. She knew the distance, the formation, the cold, mechanical routine of the blockade that had surrounded Earth for 62 years. She knew it like she knew her own heartbeat. And she hated it like nothing else in her life. The Meridian was not a warship. It was an observation platform, which was a polite way of saying it was a floating watchtower that Earth was allowed to keep because it posed no real threat to anyone. Its weapons were outdated. Its engines were slow. The Concorde had approved its design personally before allowing it to be built. They approved everything. That was the reality of life under the blockade. The Concorde was not one species. It was an alliance of 23 of them, spread across hundreds of star systems, old and powerful and deeply convinced that they alone understood how the galaxy should be run. They had been traveling between stars before humans had figured out how to smelt iron. They had built civilizations while humanity was still painting cave walls. By the time Earth looked up and reached for the sky, the Concorde was already there, watching with careful, cold eyes. And they had decided, in their ancient wisdom, that humanity was not ready. Not ready for what, exactly, was something they never fully explained. The official documents used phrases like developmental maturity and civilizational stability. The ambassadors spoke in smooth, patient voices about the risks of introducing a young and volatile species into the wider galactic community. They smiled their alien smiles and used words that sounded reasonable. But the blockade was not reasonable. It was a cage. 62 years ago, when Earth's first faster-than-light prototype had fired its engines for a test run just outside the Moon's orbit, a Concorde fleet had appeared within hours. Not with weapons drawn, not with aggression, but with something worse. Paperwork. Legal documents. Treaties that Earth had never signed but was told applied to them anyway. The lead Concorde ambassador at the time, a tall gray-skinned being called a Vihari, had explained in a calm and pleasant tone that Earth had violated 17 interstellar protocols and that, for the safety of all involved, humanity's space access would need to be managed going forward. Managed. That was the word they used. The FTL ships were impounded. The research teams were disbanded under threat of what the Concorde called corrective measures, which everyone understood to mean force. Earth's governments, divided and afraid and not ready for a war with 23 spacefaring civilizations, had agreed. They had signed the management accord. They had accepted the embargo. And then they had lived under it for 62 years. Yara had been born into that world. Her mother had been a naval engineer who spent her career designing ships that were never allowed to fly more than 2 million kilometers from Earth. Her grandmother had been one of the original protest voices, a woman who had stood outside the UN building for years with a sign that read simply, "Let us leave." It hadn't worked. Yara had chosen the military because it was the closest thing to pushing back that the system allowed. She had risen through the ranks on intelligence, discipline, and a quiet, controlled fury that she never let reach her face. She had been assigned to the Meridian because her superiors considered her stable enough to sit near the enemy without doing anything reckless. They were right. She was stable. But stable did not mean at peace. She turned away from the window when she heard footsteps behind her. It was Dr. Ilias Vorn, carrying a data tablet and looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. He probably hadn't. He was young for a senior scientist, with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers and a habit of forgetting to eat when he was working on something interesting. Right now, he was working on something very interesting. "You need to see this," he said, handing her the tablet without any introduction. Yara looked at the data on the screen. It was sensor readout from the outer blockade ring, the far boundary of the Concorde's quarantine perimeter where their heaviest patrol ships held position. The data showed a pattern in the sensor pulses. Not a random fluctuation. Not interference. Pattern. regular, deliberate, and originating from somewhere beyond the blockade's outer edge. Something is out there, Vorn said, on the other side of the Concord line, and it's been doing this for 6 weeks. Yara studied the pattern. It had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. Every pulse probed slightly differently from the last, as if whatever was sending them was testing the boundary, looking for a response, looking for a weak point, learning the shape of the wall from the outside. "You reported this?" she asked. "To the ETC intelligence office, yes. They sat on it for 4 weeks before I got a response. They said it was probably equipment drift." Yara handed the tablet back. "It's not equipment drift." "No," he agreed. "It is definitely not equipment drift." She looked back out the window. One of the Concord patrol cruisers was completing its arc, its blue running lights moving with the bored precision of a thing that had done this 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. It was a beautiful ship in the cold way that a sword is beautiful. Long and dark and built for dominance. The Concord called those ships peacekeepers. 2 days later, the Concord ambassador arrived at the Earth Council chambers in Geneva. His name was Vethsarai, a Vihari like the one who had delivered the original embargo, though no one knew if that was a coincidence or a statement. He was tall and thin and dressed in robes the color of deep water. He moved the way all Vihari moved, with a slow and deliberate grace that made humans feel rushed by comparison. The council chamber was full. Every major government had sent a representative. The room was tense in the way that rooms get when everyone knows the conversation is pointless but no one can say so out loud. Vethsarai spoke for 40 minutes. He talked about the ongoing review of Earth's developmental status. He talked about the importance of patience and cooperation. He used the word partnership 4 times in ways that clearly meant the opposite. He thanked the council for their continued compliance with the management accord. When he was done, the council's chair, a tired-looking woman from the East African Union named Director Hannah Otieno, asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "When will the blockade be lifted?" Vethsarai smiled his Vihari smile, which involved a slight tightening around the eyes and no movement of the mouth at all. "The review process is ongoing," he said. "We remain hopeful of progress." He had said those exact words, or something extremely close to them, at every council meeting for 19 years. After he left, Director Otieno sat alone in the chamber for a long time before anyone dared approach her. When her aide finally came to ask if she needed anything, she said, quietly and without any particular emotion, "I want a full count of every weapon system we have that the Concord doesn't know about." Her aide stared at her. "Write it down somewhere they can't scan," she added. Back on the Meridian, Yara received new data from Vorn at 4 in the morning. She was still awake. She often was. The pattern from beyond the blockade had changed. It was no longer probing at random points. It was focusing, concentrating its pulses on a single section of the Concord's outer perimeter, a stretch of the quarantine ring that was, according to the patrol schedules Yara had memorized years ago, the thinnest part of the Concord's active coverage. The lightest traffic, the fewest ships, whatever was out there had found a gap. And it was moving toward it. Yara sent an urgent message to Concord Patrol Command. Not because she believed they would act quickly, but because she wanted her warning on the record. The response came back in under an hour, which was unusually fast for the Concord. Said, "Acknowledged. Situation under review." Nothing else. Over the next 72 hours, Yara watched the Concord's behavior shift in ways that were small but unmistakable to someone who had spent years observing them. Ships that normally held the outer perimeter began pulling back. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a slow, quiet repositioning that left the gap in the quarantine ring slightly more open than it had been before. They were not moving to stop whatever was coming through. They were moving out of its way. Vorn noticed it too. He came to her with the analysis at midnight, and for a long time they both just stood there looking at the data without saying anything because saying it out loud would make it real. Something was coming through the blockade. Something that the Concord, with all their ancient power and all their carefully managed peacekeeping fleets, had decided they did not want to stand in front of. And the gap they were quietly creating pointed directly at Earth. "They're redirecting it," Yara said at last. Vorn nodded slowly. That's what the data looks like. She thought about the ambassador in his deep-water robes talking about partnership. She thought about 62 years of management and review and ongoing hope for progress. She thought about her grandmother standing outside the UN with a sign. Then the outer blockade alarm went off. Every screen on the meridian lit up at once. The signal that had been probing the perimeter for 6 weeks had made contact. Not a probe this time. Not a pulse. Something massive had crossed the Concorde line, and the sensor readings coming back were unlike anything in Earth's reference database. The Concorde ships held their positions. They did not intercept. They did not engage. They watched, and through the gap that they had quietly, deliberately opened, something immense and dark and very, very old began to move toward the blue-white planet that had spent 62 years trying to reach the stars. Yara stood at her window and watched it come. She did not feel fear exactly. What she felt was something harder and colder and more useful than fear. She felt the quiet snap of a decision being made somewhere deep inside her. The kind of decision that doesn't need words because it was already always there, waiting for exactly this moment. She turned from the window. "Wake the crew," she said. "All of them." Vorn was already on the comm. Outside, the stars were still there. They had always been there. And for the first time in 62 years, humanity was about to have a very good reason to reach them. Nobody had a name for it at first. The sensor teams called it the contact object. The military called it Target 1. The media, which got hold of the first blurry long-range images within hours of the crossing, called it the shadow, because that was what it looked like on screen. A shadow. A vast, slow-moving absence of light that didn't reflect the stars behind it so much as swallow them. It was Dr. Vorn who first picked up the transmission that preceded it. A deep, rhythmic broadcast on a frequency that human equipment wasn't really designed to detect. More felt than heard, like a vibration in the bones. He ran it through every translation algorithm the Meridian system had and got nothing useful, but one fragment kept repeating in a pattern that eventually resolved, when played at a certain speed through a particular filter, into something that sounded roughly like Vorn. Whether that was a name, a warning, a greeting, or something else entirely, nobody could say. But the name stuck. Humanity needed something to call it, and Vorn was what it got. The first clear images came through 48 hours after the crossing. They had been taken by a long-range Concorde sensor array before those arrays were quietly pointed in a different direction. Someone inside the Concorde's communication structure leaked them to Earth. Nobody ever found out who. The images were not what anyone expected. Vorn was not a fleet. It was not a ship in any sense that made sense to human eyes. It was a single entity, if entity was even the right word, a structure that looked partly mechanical and partly alive, the way a coral reef looks alive even though it's also a rock formation. It had no symmetry. It did not have a front or a back in any obvious way. Different sections of it moved independently, some slowly rotating, some extending long filament-like structures that trailed behind it in space like hair in water. The surface changed as it moved. Parts of it opened and closed. Things shifted inside it that were too large to be moving parts and too purposeful to be random. It was roughly 300 kilometers across. When the size estimate came out, there was silence in the Meridian briefing room for almost a full minute. Then someone in the back said, very quietly, "That's bigger than some countries." Vorn did not move toward Earth immediately. It moved toward the nearest Concorde patrol vessel first. The ship in question was a Vihari heavy cruiser called the Rethvadel, a 2-kilometer warship that was considered a serious piece of military hardware by Concorde standards. It was the kind of ship that had once appeared in Earth's orbit to remind humanity's governments what cooperation with the Management Accord actually meant in practical terms. A ship that, more than once, had made decisions for Earth simply by existing near it. Vorn took 20 minutes to reach the Rethvadel. The Vihari crew broadcast a challenge signal, then a warning signal, then a distress signal, then nothing. Vorn did not destroy the Rethvadel. Took it apart. Not violently. Not with weapons fire or energy beams. It sent those long filament structures forward, wrapped them around the cruiser with a gentleness that was somehow more frightening than aggression would have been, and then slowly, over the course of about 40 minutes, it disassembled the ship, section by section, component by component. like a child taking apart a toy to see what was inside. The pieces were not discarded. They were drawn into Vorn's body and kept there. Yara watched the whole process on the Meridian screens. She watched it with the same still, controlled expression she always wore in a crisis, and she said nothing until it was done. "It's learning," Vorn said beside her. "Yes," she agreed. "It's studying Concord technology. Concord biology, probably. It wants to understand what it's dealing with." She nodded. "And then it'll move on to the next thing it wants to understand." She meant Earth. Everyone in the room knew she meant Earth. Nobody said it. What happened over the next 72 hours confirmed Sorn's theory and made it worse. Vorn drifted through the outer Concord positions with the relaxed confidence of a thing that had never encountered a real obstacle. It examined 2 more Concord ships, though it did not take those apart. It seemed to be cross-referencing, comparing what it had already learned. Then it paused for 18 hours in a position that, according to Yara's calculations, gave it a direct line of sight to Earth's major orbital stations. It was watching. The Concord fleet, which at its current deployment represented more firepower than every military in human history combined and multiplied by 10, held position at what any reasonable observer could identify as a very safe distance. The Concord ambassador on Earth, Vethsarai, had not left the diplomatic compound in Geneva. His communications had gone quiet. Director Odieno called Yara directly on a secure channel. "Tell me what you see," she said. Yara told her everything. The disassembly of the Rethvadel, Vorn's behavior patterns, the Concord's position, all of it. There was a long pause on the other end. "And the Concord?" Odieno asked. "What are they doing?" "Watching," Yara said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Like they herded it to us," Odieno said. It was not a question. "The data is consistent with that reading," Yara said carefully. "Say it plainly, Commander." Yara looked at the screen showing Vorn's position. She looked at the Concord fleet holding well back from it. She thought about the gap in the patrol line that had appeared exactly where Vorn needed it. She thought about 62 years of management and review. "They pointed it at us," she said. "Whether they specifically guided it here or just made sure nothing stood between it and us, the result is the same. We are between Vorn and the Concord. We are what it will engage with next." "Why?" Odieno said. "Because we're the weakest thing out here. We're the thing with the lowest defenses and the least ability to cause them trouble if we're damaged. We're expendable." She paused. "We're a test." The silence that followed that word was different from the previous ones. It had weight in it. "All right," Odieno said at last. "Then we prepare." On Earth, things moved fast after that. Faster than they ever had before, because for the first time in 62 years, every single human government was looking at the same threat from the same direction. The arguments that had divided them for generations, the old borders, the old grievances, the old competitions didn't disappear. They just stopped mattering as much as the thing floating in space above them. The Emergency Terran Command was activated. It had existed on paper for decades, a theoretical body that was supposed to coordinate global defense in the event of a catastrophic external threat. No one had ever expected to actually use it. Now Director Odieno was its head, and within 36 hours she had military officers from 47 nations sitting in the same room taking orders from the same structure for the first time in history. It was ugly. It was loud. There were arguments that nearly became fistfights. There were old generals who refused to take orders from other old generals for reasons that had everything to do with national pride and nothing to do with the situation. But they stayed in the room. And slowly, painfully, they started working together. Vorn had not slept in 4 days by the time he brought his next report to Yara. He had dark circles under his eyes and his hands shook slightly when he held the tablet, but his voice was steady. "I've been analyzing Vorn's behavior patterns," he said. "All of them. Every interaction we have data on, including some things the leaked Concord files gave us about previous Vorn encounters." Yara looked up sharply. "Previous encounters?" "The Concord has met Vorn before," he said. "Or something very much like it. The files are incomplete and partially encrypted, but the core data is there. Vorn is not a new thing. It has been moving through the outer reaches of Concord space for a long time, and the Concord's response has always been the same. They redirect it. They find something in its path that will slow it down and occupy it long enough for it to move on. Yara felt something cold move through her. They've done this before. At least 3 times that I can identify from the files. He put the tablet on the table. We are not the first species they've sacrificed to it. The room was very quiet. What does it want? She asked. I don't think it wants anything the way we understand wanting. It behaves like a supremely intelligent predator, but one that is driven by something closer to curiosity than hunger. It studies things, takes apart what it can. It avoids what confuses it or produces inputs it can't process cleanly. He tapped the tablet screen. That's the key, I think. It doesn't like what it can't understand. It moves away from things that produce responses it has no reference for. Yara was quiet for a moment, thinking. So if we could produce something it has no reference for, it might hesitate. It might redirect. He nodded. That's the theory. That's a very thin thread to hang a planet on. Yes, he agreed. But it's the thread we have. 3 days later, Vorn moved. It came toward Earth's orbital infrastructure with no warning and no escalation, simply accelerating from stillness to motion in a way that its enormous size made deeply wrong-looking, the way a building suddenly moving would look wrong. The Lunar Defense Station designated Outpost Kepler, a facility that had been hastily upgraded in the 2 weeks since Vorn's arrival and now carried more firepower than it had ever been designed for, opened fire. The station's weapons lasted 4 seconds against Vorn. The shot that ended the station was not explosive. It was not a beam or a missile. Vorn extended one of its filament structures and made contact with the station's hull, and the station simply stopped working. Every system, every light, every heartbeat of every person inside it, gone. The wreckage drifted in silence. On every screen on Earth, in every language, on every platform, the footage of Outpost Kepler going dark played in a loop. People watched it in living rooms and offices and public squares. They watched it on their personal devices and on giant screens in city centers. They watched it over and over. And then, in workshops and basements and research facilities and old factories and converted warehouses, quiet things began to happen. Engineers who had spent careers designing systems the Concorde approved of began designing things the Concorde had never approved. Scientists pulled out research that had never been submitted for Concorde review because they had always known it would be rejected. Soldiers who had spent their lives preparing for wars between humans began thinking about a very different kind of war. Nobody announced it. Nobody sent out a call. It happened the way fire happens when something is dry enough and the spark finally arrives. All at once, everywhere, without permission. Earth had been patient for 62 years. It had been managed and reviewed and redirected and told to wait. It had watched its dreams get impounded and its ships get grounded and its people grow old under a ceiling that someone else had built. The ceiling was still there. Vorn was coming through it. But for the first time in 62 years, humanity stopped looking at the ceiling and started looking at the floor. And what they found in the floor, buried under decades of careful compliance, was everything they had built in secret while they waited. They had been patient. They were done being patient. 18 months passed. Anyone who had known Earth before and saw it now would not have recognized it. Not because the cities had changed, though some of them had. Not because the landscape was different, though pieces of it certainly were. What had changed was the feeling of the place, the texture of it. Earth had the feeling of a thing in motion, like a river that had been dammed for a long time and had finally found its way around the dam. Every major industrial complex on the planet was running. Not at normal capacity. Beyond it, factories that had been producing consumer goods the month before Vorn's arrival were now producing components that had no consumer purpose. Orbital construction yards that had spent decades building slow, Concorde-approved transport vessels were building other things now. The blueprints for those things had come from locked files and sealed rooms and the personal hard drives of engineers who had been quietly building towards this moment for their entire careers without ever letting on. The emergency Terran command had reorganized itself into something functional. It was still messy, still loud, still full of people who had spent their lives disagreeing with each other. But it was functional in the way that a messy, loud, disagreeing organism can be functional when it has a clear enough reason to stay moving. Vorn was a very clear reason. Fleet Admiral Yara Osei had not expected the promotion. She had expected a committee of older officers with more political weight and more comfortable relationships with the people in charge. What she got instead was Director Odieno calling her directly and saying, "You saw it first. You understand it. You're in command of the fleet." Then Odieno had paused and added, "We're building you a fleet. It should be ready in about a year." That year had been the most exhausting of Yara's life. She had not had a full night of sleep since the promotion. She had spent it reviewing designs, approving tests, overseeing trials, arguing with engineers, arguing with generals, arguing with politicians, and occasionally standing in empty corridors late at night staring at nothing because her brain needed 30 seconds of quiet before it could continue. The ships that emerged from that year were not beautiful by galactic standards. They were not elegant. They had none of the long, sculpted lines of the Concorde cruisers, none of the ancient sophistication of Vorn's nightmare geometry. They were dense and angular and built by people who had grown up looking at a cage and thinking very hard about how to break out of one. They were built to survive. They were built to be repaired under fire. They were built to be fast and brutal and surprising. 17 of them were ready. 17 was not many. Yara knew that. She also knew they were only the first wave. Dr. Sorn had not been idle either. He had spent the 18 months running the project that the ETC had quietly designated Asymmetry, a name that said very little and meant everything. The core of it came from his earliest analysis of Vorn's behavioral pattern, the observation that Vorn pulled back from things it could not understand, from inputs it had no reference for. The idea was simple in theory and almost impossibly difficult in practice. Build something that Vorn could not read. A signal. A weapon. Something in Vorn's own frequency but distorted in a way that nothing in Vorn's experience would have prepared it for. Because Vorn was old. That was both the terrifying thing and the useful thing. It was enormously old, and it had developed its behaviors and its understanding of the universe over enormous stretches of time. It knew how things worked because it had seen so many things work the same way for so long that variation had become almost impossible. Vorn expected certain responses. It expected energy to behave in known ways. It expected species to react with weapons it could catalog, with fear it could measure, with patterns it had already seen. What it did not expect was a species that had spent 62 years quietly absorbing every piece of alien technology it could get its hands on, mixing it with its own approaches, and then doing something that no ancient, pattern-driven intelligence easily anticipates: improvising. Humans improvised constantly. It was possibly their most defining characteristic. They took things that existed for one purpose and found 17 other uses for them. They broke the rules of a system not because they didn't understand the rules, but because understanding the rules showed them exactly which rules could bend. Vorn had a model of the universe built on millions of years of data. That model had no entry for what humanity was doing in Sorn's lab at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. The third major figure in what was quietly being called humanity's counteroffensive was Kale Murin, and almost nobody knew he existed. Murin was not a soldier and not a scientist. He was something harder to categorize. He had spent the last decade working in the gray space between Earth's intelligence services and the unofficial networks that operated just beneath the surface of Concorde society. Because the Concorde was not a single unified mind. It was 23 species with 23 sets of interests and 23 histories, and not all of them agreed on everything. Some of them had watched Earth's situation with something that looked, if you knew where to look, like discomfort. Murin had found those people. He had spent 10 years making contact, building trust in the slow and careful way that trust is built across species lines, learning to read beings whose biology and culture were completely unlike his own. He had sources now in 4 different Concorde member species. Not spies exactly, more like people who believed that what the Concorde had done to Earth was wrong and were willing to provide information quietly in exchange for the knowledge that someone was doing something about it. Through those sources, Murin had spent the 18 months feeding detailed Concorde tactical data to the ETC. Fleet positions, response times, communication protocols. the exact shape of the blockade sensor grid, including the parts the Concorde had never admitted existed. That information was in the bones of every plan the ETC was building. Murin himself was lean, quiet, and almost perfectly forgettable in appearance, which was a quality he had cultivated deliberately. He had a habit of standing in the corners of rooms and watching the center of them. He sat across from Yara now in the Meridian's briefing room, which was where he had come to deliver his latest report in person because certain things should not travel over any network. "The Concorde knows we're building," he said. "Of course they do," Yara replied. "They've discussed intervention twice at the council level. Both times they decided against it." He paused. "They think we're panicking. They think we're building things we don't know how to use because we're scared. They expect us to make mistakes and for Vorn to deal with us faster than their intervention would." "They're wrong," Yara said. "Yes, but that works in our favor for as long as they believe it." Vorn had not been idle during the 18 months. It had settled into a slow, grinding process of dismantling Earth's outer infrastructure, piece by piece, the way a careful engineer removes components to understand a machine. It was not destroying for the sake of destruction. Everything it took apart it studied, absorbed, added to its growing model of this system and its inhabitants. Earth had fed it carefully during that time. Automated systems, old satellites, decoy probes packed with sensor data designed to be interesting enough to hold Vorn's attention but not so advanced that it would lose interest quickly. Soren had designed those too. He thought of them as chapters in a book he was writing for Vorn to read, each one slowing the creature down while keeping it engaged. It had worked, mostly. Vorn had consumed 17 decoy probes and 11 decommissioned satellites over 18 months, and each one had bought time. The time was almost up now. Vorn was turning its attention toward Earth's inhabited orbital stations, the ones with humans in them. The next phase was going to be different. On the day that Yara's fleet was certified ready for deployment, the Concorde made one last move. An envoy arrived. Not Vethsarai this time. This one was from a different species, a short and wide-bodied being called a Thurak, with 4 eyes and a reputation for being the Concorde's most effective deal closers. His name translated roughly as one who finalizes things, which said a great deal about how he viewed his own importance. He met with Director Odieno in a closed session that lasted 3 hours. Yara was not invited but received a full transcript from Odieno afterward. The Thurak had offered Earth a ceasefire. Or rather, he had offered something that he called a ceasefire, which upon examination turned out to mean that if Earth formally surrendered its sovereignty to Concorde oversight, meaning if it gave up any claim to independent governance, independent military, and independent space access, the Concorde would consider intervening in the Vorn situation on Earth's behalf. He had presented this as an act of generosity. Odieno's response was in the transcript as a single line: "Tell the Concorde to watch what happens next." The Thurak had left the same day. When Yara read that line, she felt something that she recognized after a moment as pride. Not the loud kind, the deep, quiet kind that sits in the chest and doesn't need to announce itself. 3 days later, she stood on the bridge of the lead ship of the Terran First Warfleet, a vessel that had been named, by a vote among its crew, the Meridian's Answer. The name was not officially authorized. Yara had authorized it herself, which was close enough. Around her, 16 other ships held formation. They were not a beautiful fleet, but they were real and they were ready, and every single person on every single one of them knew exactly what they were doing and had chosen to be there. The blockade perimeter sat ahead of them. The Concorde's patrol ships were in their usual positions, their blue running lights moving in their usual arcs, doing their usual indifferent rounds. But something was different now. Soren's team had spent the last 3 months working on a secondary project alongside the asymmetry weapon. They called it the Mirror. Its purpose was simple. The Concorde's sensor jamming, the system that had kept Earth's long-range communications and navigation blind for 62 years, worked by broadcasting a specific interference pattern on a specific frequency. If you knew the pattern, and if you had been studying it carefully for 62 years without the Concorde knowing you were studying it, you could, in theory, produce a counterfrequency that canceled it. In theory. In practice, it worked. The mirror came online at 0400 hours ship time. The Concorde's jamming grid went quiet along a corridor approximately 30 kilometers wide directly ahead of the Terran fleet. Not broken, not destroyed, just temporarily overridden, like pressing mute on a signal that had been screaming for 60 years. The patrol ships scrambled. Alarms went off across the blockade network. Yara looked at the corridor of clear space ahead of her. Clear space that led to open stars that she had spent her entire life being told she was not allowed to reach. She thought about her grandmother standing outside the UN building with her sign. She thought about 3 dead ships over 62 years of diplomacy and patience. She thought about Outpost Kepler, dark and drifting. "Take us through," she said, and the fleet moved. Open space felt different from inside a blockade. Yara noticed it the moment the fleet cleared the perimeter. There was no physical difference, no change in pressure or light or the feel of the ship around her. But there was something in the quality of the darkness outside the viewport that was different. Wider somehow, deeper, as if the universe on this side of the Concorde's line was the real one, and what she had grown up in was a model of it. A smaller, reduced copy that someone else had decided was enough for humanity. She gave herself 3 seconds to feel it. Then she got back to work. Vorn had detected them almost immediately. That was not a surprise. Vorn detected everything. What was a surprise was what it did next, which was nothing. For 11 minutes after the Terran fleet broke through the blockade perimeter, Vorn simply stopped moving. Its filament structures, which were usually in constant motion, extended and retracted in their slow alien rhythm, went still. The slow rotation of its outer sections ceased. The massive, irregular body of the thing went quiet in a way that the sensor teams described as motionless, but that felt, to the people watching the readouts, more like listening. "It knows we're here," Vorn said from his station on the bridge. He was serving as the fleet science advisor for the engagement, which mostly meant he stood behind Yara with a data tablet and gave her information she needed in exactly the order she needed it. He was good at it. "It's never seen our energy signature before," Yara said. "No. Nothing like us has ever broken through the Concorde line from the inside. Not spontaneously. Not like this." He paused. "It doesn't know what we are." "Good," she said. "Keep it that way as long as possible." The plan had been built around 3 phases. The first was confusion. The second was pressure. The third was the asymmetry weapon and whatever came after it. Each phase existed because the one before it might not work. Yara had planned for failure at every step, which meant the plan was ugly and complicated and had about 40 branching paths. She would have preferred something simpler. Simple things were faster to execute. But simple things also assumed the enemy behaved predictably, and Vorn had already proven that its behavior was only predictable until it wasn't. The first phase began with signal noise. Earth's fleet did not open with weapons fire. It opened with communication. Every ship in the fleet began broadcasting simultaneously on frequencies across the entire spectrum. A flood of overlapping signals that contained no coherent message because the goal was not to communicate. The goal was to overwhelm. Vorn processed everything it encountered. It was how it learned. Feeding its 17 ships broadcasting overlapping, contradicting, layered signals all at once was the equivalent of speaking every human language at the same time at maximum volume directly into someone's ear. Vorn's filament structures moved, not toward the fleet, sideways. They extended and retracted at odd angles, as if reaching for something to stabilize against. "It doesn't like that," one of the sensor operators said. "Good," Yara said again. She had said that word a lot in the last 11 minutes. The second phase began when Vorn started to adapt. Because it would, they knew it would, it always adapted, it was what it did. After about 8 minutes, the entity began filtering the signal noise, processing it in layers, working toward understanding the pattern beneath the chaos the way a skilled ear can pick a single instrument out of a full orchestra with enough time. They didn't give it enough time. The fleet split into 3 groups exactly as planned. Group 1, led by the Meridian's answer, pushed toward Vorn's leading edge. Group 2 swung wide left. Group 3 went wide right. The movement itself was the message. "We are surrounding you." Not successfully, not actually. Vorn was 300 kilometers across and no human fleet could genuinely surround it, but the behavioral signal mattered. The Concorde and every other species that VORN had ever encountered had responded to it by either advancing or retreating along a single axis. They moved in straight lines. They attacked from one direction or fled in one direction because their tactics were built on experience, and experience had always given them enough to work with. Humans did not do this. Humans had spent 62 years watching and analyzing and arguing over and rewriting tactical doctrine in underground bases where the Concorde sensors couldn't reach. They had studied Vorn's known behavior from every angle available to them. They had built a dozen different models of how the engagement might go, and they had run those models until they understood not just what VORN would likely do, but what would happen if every assumption they had was wrong. And then they had agreed that the assumptions would probably be at least partially wrong and built flexibility into the plan at every level, down to the individual ship commanders, who had standing orders to deviate from the plan entirely if they identified a better option and the time to take it. The engagement that followed was not clean. It was not the kind of battle that gets described in simple terms afterward. Ships moved at angles that no Concorde tactical doctrine would have produced. Attack runs came from unexpected directions and then redirected mid-approach. Feints were made and abandoned and resumed. Electronic interference was dropped and restored in patterns that were irregular enough to prevent VORN from building a working model of what they were doing. VORN responded with the tools it had always used. It extended its filaments. It broadcast in frequencies designed to disrupt electronic systems. It moved with sudden bursts of acceleration that should have allowed it to position itself advantageously against the smaller ships. But the smaller ships were not where it expected them to be when it got there. The 3 ships that were lost in the first hour were lost because of Vorn's speed. It was faster than they had hoped, and 2 vessels from Group 3 and 1 from Group 2 were caught in a filament sweep they didn't get clear of in time. The losses were real and they hit hard. Yara received the casualty reports without changing her expression and filed them in the part of herself that she would deal with later, when there was a later to deal with anything. She kept moving. Phase 3 came 90 minutes into the engagement. Vorn activated the asymmetry weapon from a secondary console on the Meridian's Answers bridge. The weapon itself was built into the ship's communication array, which was an irony that Vorn appreciated and that Yara had noted with something like grim humor when the design was finalized. A communication array because what they were doing was talking to VORN. Not in words, in frequency. The asymmetry signal was built from Vorn's own internal broadcast, the deep rhythmic pulse that every ship in the fleet had been recording since they broke the perimeter. Vorn had spent the last 6 weeks working out the exact structure of that pulse, the way it was timed, the way it modulated, the way it functioned as a kind of internal language that VORN used to coordinate its own parts. Then he had reversed pieces of it. Not all of it, specific sections. The parts that, based on his behavioral models, corresponded to Vorn's orientation functions, the internal signals it used to know where it was, which direction it was facing, what it was approaching. When the asymmetry signal went out, VORN stopped. Not the way it had stopped at the beginning of the battle. That stop had been the careful stillness of something assessing an unknown. This stop was different. This stop was the stop of something that had lost its footing. Its filaments, which had been moving with intent, went loose and drifted. The rotation of its outer sections became erratic, some speeding up and some slowing down in ways that had no pattern. For 12 full seconds, 300 kilometers of ancient, incomprehensible intelligence hung in space and simply did not know what it was doing. 12 seconds was enough time for Kale Murin to do his part. Murin was not on the Meridian's Answer. He was on a ship called the Digger, a small, fast vessel that had been classified as a support craft so that it could move independently of the main fleet without drawing attention. The Digger had been positioned during the first phase of the battle at a point that was, by the time Phase 3 arrived, exactly where it needed to be. Close to Vorn's surface. Closer than any sane tactical doctrine would have permitted. Murin had designed the beacon himself. It was small and very difficult to detect, built to emit at a frequency that VORN processed but didn't flag as foreign because it mimicked the low-level background noise of interstellar space. Once attached to Vorn's surface, it would track the entity wherever it went, for as long as the power cell lasted, which was approximately 4 years. The boarding action was not, technically, a boarding action. Murin's team never went inside VORN. They approached the surface, which was close enough to terrifying, because Vorn's surface was not still and it was not safe and it was not made of anything that human engineering had prior experience with. The team moved fast, in suits designed for environments that human engineering had no prior experience with, and they placed the beacon in a deep ridge in Vorn's outer structure, and they got back to the digger before Vorn's 12-second pause ended. When Vorn resumed functioning, the beacon was already part of it, broadcasting silently, going wherever Vorn went. What happened next was the part that none of them had planned for because none of them had genuinely expected it. Vorn pulled back. It had taken damage in the engagement, or at least the functional equivalent of damage. Sections of it that had been active went quiet. Its filaments retracted entirely, pulling in close to its body rather than trailing loose in space. Its movement, when it began again, was away from the fleet. Not fast, not panicked, but away. The observation Concorde fleet, which had been holding position at its safe distance throughout the entire battle, watched this happen. Their sensor records would later show, in perfect detail, the moment that an entity which had moved through Concorde space with the confidence of a thing that had never been seriously opposed began moving away from 17 ships built by a species that the Concorde had decided 62 years ago was too primitive to be allowed among the stars. Nobody on Earth's fleet cheered. They were too tired, too aware of the 3 ships that had gone dark, too aware of how close several of the outcomes had come to being much worse. Yara stood at the viewport for a long time after Vorn's form began to shrink in the distance. She watched it go. She thought about a lot of things. She thought about the 62 years. She thought about the management and the review and the patience that had been demanded and given and then betrayed. She thought about Outpost Kepler drifting dark in the orbit of the moon. Then she straightened up and turned to face her bridge. "Damage reports," she said. "All ships. And get me Sorn." Sorn appeared beside her. He looked like someone had run him through a very demanding obstacle course and then asked him to solve a complicated math problem at the finish line. He was also very faintly smiling. "The beacon?" she said. "Active," he confirmed. "And transmitting cleanly." She nodded. "Good." She paused. "How long until the Concorde calls?" He checked his tablet. There were already signals queued in the communications array. "A lot of them. I think," he said. "They already did." Outside the viewport, the Concorde observer fleet was moving. Not toward Earth. Not toward Vorn. Toward the Terran fleet. Approaching carefully, the way you approach something that has just done something you did not believe it was capable of doing, and you need a moment to recalibrate your entire model of the world. Yara watched them come. She had one more thing to do before she took any Concorde calls. She opened a channel to the entire fleet, all 17 ships, the 14 that were whole and the 3 that were damaged and the ones that were missing pieces of their crews. "Well done," she said. "Every one of you. Well done." It wasn't much, but it was true and it was hers to give, and for a moment there was silence on every channel in the Terran fleet. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say. The silence of people who felt something too large for words and chose, for a moment, not to try. Then the Concorde signals started coming in again, and there was work to do. The way station was called Neutral Ground 7. It was a Concorde facility, technically, but it had been decommissioned 30 years ago and sat in the empty space between 2 star systems, belonging to no one and claimed by nothing. It was the kind of place the Concorde used when they needed a meeting that couldn't be held in anyone's home territory, which was itself a statement about how the Concorde viewed this particular meeting. They had not wanted it on their ground. They had not, apparently, considered suggesting Earth. The station was old, and it showed. Its corridors were wide and clean, but the kind of clean that comes from emptiness rather than care. The air had the flat, recycled quality of a place that had been sealed and unsealed many times by many different species. The lights were adjusted to a setting that was supposed to be comfortable for everyone inside and ended up being slightly wrong for all of them. 23 delegations. 23 species. The full council of the Concorde, gathered in one room, something that happened rarely and only when the thing requiring their attention was large enough to demand it. Humanity sent 5 people. Director Hannah Odieno led them. She had not slept well in a year and it did not show. She wore a plain dark suit and carried nothing. No tablet, no documents, no briefcase. She had memorized everything she needed and did not require props. Behind her came Yara, in her fleet uniform with the new admiral's insignia that she still wasn't fully used to seeing in mirrors. Then Sorn, because Odieno had decided that the people who walked into this room should be the ones who had actually done the work. Murin was there too, quiet as always, positioned slightly to the left where he could see every exit and every delegate's face at the same time. The fifth was a legal mind named Deo Obi, a small and precise woman who had spent her career studying interstellar law and who had, over the past 6 months, developed a working theory that the management accord was not legally binding under the very Concord statutes it claimed to operate within. She had a gift for understatement, Deo Obi. She called it a working theory. Her colleagues called it a 1,700-page argument that dismantled the legal foundation of the blockade like removing bricks from a wall. The Concord delegations were already seated when the humans arrived. That had been deliberate on the Concord's part, a piece of old diplomatic protocol that meant the party already seated held positional authority. Odieno had been briefed on this by Murin and had shrugged and said they could sit wherever they liked. She walked to the human side of the table and sat down without hurry. The others sat with her. Nobody rushed. Nobody looked around the room with wide eyes. Nobody appeared impressed, or nervous, or grateful to be there. They sat down the way people sit down when they have decided that this table belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone else. The lead Concord ambassador opened the session. His name was Counselor Vethkon, the highest-ranking diplomatic voice the Concord had, a different Vihari from the ones humanity had dealt with before and reportedly one of the most experienced negotiators in Concord history. He was old by Vihari standards, which meant very old by most standards, and he moved and spoke with the precision of a being that had handled difficult conversations for centuries. He began with an expression of regret. It was carefully constructed. It acknowledged that the situation involving VORN had placed Earth in an unnecessarily exposed position. It expressed the Concord's appreciation for humanity's effective response to the threat. It used the word unfortunate 3 times. It did not use the words we were wrong or we chose to do this or we have been lying to you for 62 years. Odieno let him finish. She waited a full 10 seconds after his last word before she spoke, which was a different kind of precision. "Counselor," she said, "I am going to save us both a great deal of time." She put a single document on the table in front of her. 1 page, large text. She had specifically made it 1 page because she wanted everyone in the room to be able to read it from their seats. "These are the terms under which Earth will participate in any ongoing relationship with the Concord," she said. "They are not a starting point for negotiation. They are the terms." A sound moved through the delegations around the table. Not a word. A texture of sound that translated across all 23 species as something between surprise and offense. Vethkon's expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. "Director Odieno, with respect, the purpose of this summit is to discuss a framework. The blockade ends," Odieno said, "completely. Every installation, every patrol, every sensor array and jamming relay. Dismantled and verified by our own people. Not your people. Ours." She spoke clearly and without raising her voice. "All technology that was embargoed under the management accord is returned to us or provided in full specification. Every research file, every prototype, every design that was impounded from our people over 62 years. All of it." Another sound from the delegations. Louder. "Earth receives a permanent seat on the Concord Council with full voting rights, including veto authority on decisions that affect unconsenting species within Concord jurisdiction." She paused. "We will not be the last species this has happened to. That stops now." "And the VORN data," Sorn said from beside her, because they had agreed he would take this one. "The beacon we placed is transmitting Vorn's location. We will share that data openly, and we will lead the joint response effort to track and contain VORN on a permanent basis. Because unlike the approach the Concord has used historically, we are not interested in redirecting it. We intend to solve it." The room was quiet. Then one of the delegates, from a species called the Ralith, stood up. The Ralith were among the older Concord members, and this particular one had a reputation for saying the things other delegates thought but considered impolitic. He pointed a long, blue-gray finger at the humans across the table. "You are one species," he said, "newly arrived, and proven by any standard of galactic civilization. You have fought one engagement against one entity. You presume to walk in here and dictate terms to 23 civilizations." Nobody moved at the human table. Otieno looked at the Ralith delegate for a moment. Then she looked at Yara. Yara had not planned to speak. It had not been in the format they had discussed. But she looked at the Ralith delegate and thought about 62 years, and thought about the 3 ships that had gone dark, and thought about every version of this conversation that humanity had been trying to have for 2 generations and had been turned away from with smooth words and patient smiles and management protocols. She leaned forward. "You spent 62 years deciding what we were," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. "You built a cage around our world based on your conclusions. You pointed a threat at us that you had been hiding from for decades because you decided our lives were a useful shield. You watched us go into space to fight something you wouldn't face, and you called a meeting so you could offer us the same table you've always set for us, where we sit where you put us and accept what you've decided." She paused. "You want to know what we've proven? We've proven you were wrong. About what we are. About what we can do. About what happens when you finally give us a reason to stop being polite." She sat back. "So yes, those are the terms." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. The one before it had been the silence of offense. This one was the silence of people recalculating. Vethcon looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at the other delegations. A series of rapid, quiet exchanges happened across the table. The multi-species equivalent of glances and small gestures between people who have worked together long enough to communicate without words. One of the smaller delegations signaled their agreement with a gesture that their species used to indicate formal acceptance. Then another. Then a third. The Ralith delegate sat back down and said nothing. Took 4 hours. Not because the terms were seriously contested. It was clear within the first hour that the Concord was going to accept them. It took 4 hours because 23 species with 23 different legal frameworks all needed to formally register their agreement in their own way, and because some of them had questions that were not about whether to accept but about the details of how. Deo Obi handled the details. She handled them with the quiet, precise expertise of someone who had spent a decade preparing for exactly this conversation and was entirely comfortable in it. When Concord lawyers tried to introduce language that softened specific terms, she removed it. When they proposed timelines for implementation that were longer than the agreement specified, she declined them. She was very polite about all of it. She was also completely immovable. By the end of the 4th hour, the document was signed. It was not a perfect document. It was a beginning. Otieno knew that. She had known it going in. 62 years of a relationship that wrong did not resolve into something right in one afternoon in a decommissioned way station. There would be arguments ahead. There would be Concord factions that resisted the new arrangement. There would be things to fight for that they had not yet identified because they did not yet know enough about the universe they had been kept out of to know what they were missing. But the ceiling was gone. Legally, formally, permanently gone, committed to paper that 23 civilizations had signed. Otieno folded the document, put it in her jacket pocket, stood up, and thanked the Concord for the meeting. She meant very little of that last part, but she said it because there was a time to be the thing the Concord had underestimated, and there was a time to be what came after that. They were in what came after now. 1 year later, the first joint Terran-Concord deep space expedition assembled at the edge of the solar system. It was a large fleet, the biggest cooperative effort in the short history of humanity's relationship with the wider galaxy. 12 Concord vessels from 7 different member species, and at the front of the formation, the Meridian's Answer, its hull repaired from the engagement with VORN and its crew supplemented with new members who had been born into the blockade years and were going into open space for the first time in their lives. The expedition's mission was VORN. Tracking it, studying it, eventually, in whatever way proved most effective, dealing with it permanently. Not redirecting it. Not sacrificing some other world to it. Solving it. Humanity was leading. Dr. Sorn stood at the observation deck of the Meridian's Answer and watched the stars. They were the same stars they had always been. He had studied them his whole life. He had spent years looking at them through blockade-limited sensors, measuring them from the wrong side of a line that someone else had drawn. Now there was no line. A young crew member came to stand beside him. She was barely 20, born the year the blockade was still being strictly enforced, and she had never seen open space from the inside of it before. She stood at the viewport with an expression that Vorn recognized because he had felt it himself when the fleet crossed the perimeter for the first time. "What does it feel like?" she asked. "Actually being out here?" He thought about the question. He thought about the years. He thought about Outpost Kepler and the 3 ships that didn't come back from the battle and the long, ugly 18 months of building things in secret while Vorn circled and the Concorde watched. He thought about standing in labs at 3 in the morning with his hands shaking from exhaustion and his mind moving too fast to sleep. "Like a door," he said. "We didn't knock. We took it off the hinges." She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the stars. The fleet accelerated. The stars did not get closer the way they do in old stories, where the hero rides toward the horizon and the landscape opens up around them. Space does not open up that way. It just keeps going, vast and dark and full of things that have not been discovered yet. Things waiting for someone patient and stubborn and willing to build in secret for 60 years before stepping through. Humanity was out here now. And the universe, for better or worse, was going to have to get used to it.